So hi everyone and happy Friday. I'm Dana and welcome to our Azure DevOps 101 series. So every Friday we'll have Martin with us to talk about DevOps, and today it's introduction to Azure DevOps. And over to you, Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you for everyone for joining. Appreciate you taking an hour out of your day, wherever you may be in the world. And also thanks a lot to the guys at Cloud Lunch and Learn as well for having me for not just one of these, but the whole month. So we're gonna start off actually taking it right from the top and really just making sure that everyone has a good level set understanding of what DevOps is outside of technology, because it's so much more than that. And throughout the series, we're going to dive into other topics as well. So hopefully you'll be able to make those as well. Okay, so let's get going. First of all, so a little bit about myself. So I'm a senior technical consultant with Insono. They're based in Chicago in the United States. Although I'm in the UK at the minute. I work with a US team there as a consultant. I'm also an Azure MVP. Outside of that, from a technology perspective, I'm also a DevOps ambassador with the DevOps Institute as well. And also a certified DevOps leader. So most of the stuff that I do, you can find on my blog. So any of the speaking engagements that I've done can be found on there as well. And I also do a podcast as well on DevOps on all kinds of subjects. So feel free to check that out as well. Okay, so first of all, I just want to start off with a description of what DevOps is. And I think this is really important, and some of you will recognize where this has come from. So DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. So that statement, or that quote there, actually comes from a guy called Donovan Brown, and he's one of the DevOps leads at Microsoft. And it's kind of fitting. We're talking about Azure and various related technologies, but also from a DevOps perspective as well. Microsoft have done a huge amount in this area, and I've always really liked this explanation of what DevOps is. I think the wording's very carefully chosen, which is really good, and I think it really attests for me the key things to what DevOps is before you get to technology. One of the things you'll notice about that statement is it doesn't mention technology in any way, really. So we don't talk about tooling in there or anything like that. But what we do talk about is the collaboration of people, the improved communication between people. We'll talk about union, bringing processes together, and also the products that we work on as well. And then we enable continuous delivery. We'll talk about continuous delivery in a little bit to deliver value to end users. And that's really what DevOps is all about. It's about delivering value to your end users. And your end users could be anything. It doesn't matter. DevOps is born out of engineering, but it can actually apply outside of software engineering to infrastructure teams as well. I've done successful implementations of DevOps with infrastructure teams, and it works really, really well. You just have to tweak some of the things that you're doing to make sure that the same things can apply, or the processes that you need to apply do. So don't be discouraged by DevOps if you are not in software, because although a lot of the content you will see about DevOps is targeted on software engineering, it doesn't just have to be about software engineering. So what exactly is the goal of DevOps? Okay, so there's lots. Okay, we could have a full session on what the goals of DevOps and the benefits of DevOps are, but I've tried to pick out the biggest things that from talking to my clients that I work with people in the community that I come across, and also people at DevOps Institute as well, and the fellow ambassadors that I get the pleasure of working with. I've come up with a list that I think is probably the top 5, I would say. So deployment frequency is one of the key things. So at the minute we're talking we're not specifically talking business benefits, but we are talking about just general goals of DevOps. Okay, so deployment frequency is the first thing. So when our developers and when our operations teams start focusing on fundamentally the same goals, they start working better together, and that working together in a better way, and that encouragement that goes between those teams to produce better results means that you can start to deploy more frequently. And there's a good example that I'll talk about in a little bit around revenue when we talk about business goals. It's a really crude example, and quite honestly, it does definitely have flaws in it, but it proves the point as to why this kind of stuff's important. So faster time to market, and this is something that is often overlooked from my opinion, but I think this is a really critical one. Okay, so when you are working in an industry that is so reliant on being able to release anything before your competitors, being able to have a faster time to market, and the description between the bottom there is not quite right, unfortunately. But faster time to market is really critical, because with a faster time to market, you are able to take your idea from inception, when the idea is discussed with the team, all the way to release quicker than your competitors. And fundamentally, if you have the ability to do that over your competitors, then you are going to perform better in your market than your competitors do. Okay, the next one is around lower failure rates. And lower failure rates is a cultural thing in a lot of ways. So I have this long-standing belief that we shouldn't incentivize failure. Okay, so failure is so often outside of our control as engineers, whether you're a developer or whether you're in operations. Quite often it's a platform level thing or a service provider thing, and there's nothing we can do about it. So incentivizing the avoidance of failure for me isn't something that is really that constructive. But you do get lower failure rates when you start to bring these processes together, and when you start to have people working more collaboratively together, because they are bouncing ideas off of each other earlier in the process, and there is a true mutual understanding of what each other's role does throughout the whole process. That inevitably leads to lower failure rates at the end. Okay, next one is around shorter lead times. Okay, so once you've invested the time in getting the culture of your organization right, once you've then invested time in getting your processes and your people right, it's then onto the technology. And this is where you can start to make some really big gains in DevOps. So shorter lead times on top of what you already do as a mature DevOps based organization. Technology really adds the automation on top of that, but it's vital, because that automation is what means instead of running that process twice an hour manually, you can now run it 15 times an hour in an automated way. You get all the benefits of that being automated. So you get a high level of idempotency, meaning we run it 15 times with the same parameters, we get the same result 15 times. That is exactly what idempotency is. It means from a computer does exactly what it's told to. That's the whole point of automation. So given a set criteria, it will come out with the exact same thing or the specific thing that we expect. And then improve recovery times. So the ability to then recover from failures is a really key metric in DevOps. So mean time to resolution or mean time to recovery, MTTR, is a really key metric that should be recorded on. And when I spoke a little earlier about failure rates, this is the opposing metric that I think you should monitor instead. So we should, like I say, we shouldn't incentivize that failure is going to happen, because it is. So setting a broad SLA within your teams to say, let's measure availability, can be counterproductive, because there are so many things that can go against you. However, what is a useful metric to measure from the outset and throughout your DevOps transformation journey is how long it takes you to recover from those failures. The shorter that time is, the more that demonstrates a deep understanding of the application and the architecture and exactly what it takes to get that service back up and running. And that information that you gather from those failures can be used to put back into your retrospectives and your sprints that you do as a team in DevOps as part of the Agile framework, and can really start to improve that recovery time and shorten that recovery time. Because let's not forget, in business, the longer something is down, the more money it costs. Fundamentally, time is money. So what are the four main values of DevOps? So we've talked about some of the key things that it looks at. What are the main values of DevOps? And we've talked a tiny bit on this. So with people, process, culture, and technology. And personally, I think this is the order it needs to be done in to be successful. So first of all, I would start with culture, right? Culture is around making sure that there's a shared responsibility for what you own and what you build as a team. So that means things like better collaboration across your development, your operational teams, and the business. That's very important. Better transparency and better communication. Okay, and that's really what we mean by culture in DevOps. It's around making sure that those cogs are nicely intertwined and run smoothly, and don't need to be oiled frequently, like in a lot of other organizations that don't practice DevOps. But once you have your culture right, and this can take a long time to do, okay, it's not something that will happen overnight. It's something that can take quite a while. So it's really, really important to make sure that you get that culture right, and it has to be driven from the top of your organization. And when I say the top of your organization, I mean C-suite. C-suite have to buy into what DevOps means for the business and what it will help the business achieve, okay? And it's really, really important that those things are in place to make sure that culture drives down throughout the organization. Once culture is right, that will then drive the people that you need within your organization. Okay, DevOps is all about people and soft skills. Technical skills you can teach to people who want to be taught the tools and technology and how to do various things. But it's the soft skills that really make great DevOps engineers, great architects, and great consultants. So people have to change the way we deliver value to end users. It's no longer acceptable to just things over the fence to operations and expect them to pick it up and to work. It's all about working together and understanding that pain operations go through if you are a software engineer, and understanding if you're in operations what happens from a development perspective for you to then have to be in a position to release that software. Throughout that process, some people will leave the organization, right? It's not a great thing to say, but so often in DevOps transformations, some people just don't think that it's a right fit for them. They've worked in certain ways for so long that they don't feel it's something they can change. That's okay, right? So there's things you can do. There's different roles they could be moved into, but some might decide that they want to leave the organization. When you're going through this, you should never try and force people into doing things that they don't want to do. That will generate the wrong results, and the effort that you're putting in to make this a success will ultimately be in vain in a lot of ways. So when our developers, when our operations teams, and when the business start focusing on the same set of goals and start working together, that is what starts to generate value. In order to then work together, people have to adopt better processes, sometimes new processes. We have to improve some processes that we have. We have to get rid of some processes that we no longer need. But we need to plan to adopt continuous collaboration. And by continuous collaboration, you can see in the middle there, we're talking about a few things. We're talking about plan, develop, release, monitor, and then repeat the same thing. So 4 key things: plan, develop, release, monitor, and then repeat. You can imagine that as a bit of a cycle. And then last but not least, as we've already said, the amount of value you will get from getting the right culture, people, and process in place is huge. Add to that the ability to automate a lot of those things. So whether those are builds, whether those are releases, configuration management, security scanning, all of those sorts of things. Add technology on to be able to do that. That is what gets you to the next level of maturity. But to be able to implement that technology correctly, you have to understand the previous three things and how they affect your organization and how they work with your organization. It's really critical to make sure that those things are in place. So hopefully, so far, that gives you a bit of an idea as to when organizations start with technology on a DevOps transformation, it will either take them a lot longer to achieve that, or it will simply fail because the fundamental things are not in place first before getting to the end where we can really use technology to drive what we need to do even further. Okay, so what challenges does DevOps solve? So again, we could be here for a long time talking about the challenges that DevOps solves, but fundamentally it's down to key things, right? So first of all, developers are generally acutely unaware of quality assurance and operations roadblocks, right? We all know the situation, and we've all joked about this many times, I'm sure, is that developers often take code, they ship something, they pass a package to the operations team with no release notes, nothing, and expect them to release it. Operations don't know how that works, what the prerequisites are, what specification of hardware it needs to run on, if it needs to run on a VM, or if it can even run in a more cloud native service. So those are really key things, right? And that problem gets bigger the more you get into the cloud. It was a big problem before the cloud, let alone when there's hundreds of extra technologies. So on the flip side of that, quality assurance and operations, like our testers and our support teams, they work across many different features, and they generally have little wider context into the business as to what's happening. Fundamentally, operations' job is to keep the lights on and keep everything going, whereas developers' job is to release features as quickly and as qualitatively as possible, so the business can market new functionality within their application. That's fundamentally what it's about. So both of those groups have drastically opposing goals, and that is what leads to inefficiency. And that is fundamentally why DevOps is around, is to try and break down those inefficiencies and break down those roadblocks and have fundamentally developers and operations teams working together. Okay, so let's move on to talking about maturity within DevOps. So again, this is an important thing to discuss. So you can do DevOps well, and you can do DevOps poorly, and you can do DevOps okay, right? All three are doing DevOps, but only one, maybe two of those organizations will have real tangible results that they can show for their efforts. So it's really important to understand the different phases of maturity along the process. And there's fundamentally 4 phases, although this can be broken out into lots of different subsections. So the first is around waterfall. So this is the traditional way of working, okay? So development teams write their code over a specific period of time. It could be weeks, it could be months. All of those teams merge their code in order to have that feature released. There's been so many changes made that the actual integration of that could take weeks or even months, because the code you are now working with looks so different to what it did at the previous release. And that's what a waterfall effect on a code base would look like if you were developing it that way. Next is around continuous integration. So there's a lot of work that would need to be done to get from that waterfall stage into continuous integration. But CI for short is really a way of integrating that newly developed code into the main body. So if you think of source code management, so Git's the obvious one, and by default that would be master, although a lot of people are now calling their main branch main instead. That would be the master branch. Okay, so this is everyone committing their code into that master branch, and then that saves time when the team is ready to release, because that process is usually automated and will produce a build artifact at the end. But to be able to do that effectively, what is happening in there really is that to get to continuous integration, you are working in sprints. So we are not working for months on end to be able to get our code into the repository and release it. We're working in small incremental steps. So that makes it a lot easier for us to then run builds and then produce an artifact at the end. And the build artifact at the end is what you release to the environment it needs to be released to. Okay, so next is continuous delivery. So continuous delivery, or CD, and continuous deployment, obviously they're both CD. They are actually separate things, although I do hear the term swapped and used in various different yeah, I do. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I do hear the term continuous delivery and continuous deployment used interchangeably quite often, and they are actually separate, discrete things. Okay, so when we talk about continuous delivery, that's really an extension of continuous integration. So if you think that we have built and run some tests in our CI pipeline, as we call it, and we produce an artifact, our extension of that is executing a continuous delivery pipeline. So we would then add additional automation on top of there, additional testing on top of that, so that we don't just merge code. The code is ready to deploy at that point with no human intervention. And that's really the next stage of maturity. Okay, so once we have got to that phase of continuous delivery, it's really onto the next stage, which is the goal nirvana, which is where everyone wants to get to, which is continuous deployment. This is the most advanced state by a long way. So as it says there, it's a practice of deploying all the way into production without any human interaction. There's actually very few organizations I know of do this and do this well. But fundamentally, this is where your developers would commit code to the main repository, a pull request would be made, the review would happen, and anything that would need to happen as part of that process, the code review process would happen. Once that is merged back into master, it then deploys to any non-production environments, and it does what it needs to along the way. You would then keep going all the way through different environments using different gates to be able to control the flow of the release all the way up to production. And the fundamental idea really is that you go all the way through to production, even through the gates, doing various different analysis of metrics. So it might be using some data from log analytics to figure out whether it's a go or no go. It might be figuring out using application insights if you're generating exceptions, and rolling back the release if you get to a point where it's not working. So there's lots you can do in Azure technology to be able to enable that true end-to-end automated deployment. And that's one of the things that one of the later sessions goes into a little bit more. Okay, so now some of the fundamentals of DevOps are being covered and are being discussed. One of the things that is important is to recognize that within the framework, I guess, that is DevOps, there are lots of different ways to structure your team and lots of different ways that teams could work. And one of the things that's important to understand is even within an organization that might mature over time itself. So you might start off in one topology model. As they get more mature, they might go into another model. And then they might get to where you want to right at the end. And this is one of the things that actually prevents a lot of organizations from being successful, in my opinion, when it comes to DevOps transformation, is a lot of organizations see themselves getting to a specific point, but then they don't go further. They don't take that next step forward. So there's a few topologies to have a look at. Let's have a look at some of them in a bit more detail. So the first model is probably the one that everyone aspires to. And again, this is probably one of the reasons why a lot of organizations fail at this transformation, is because they aim for the top of the ladder, as it were, rather than taking steps up to get to the top of that ladder. They aim for the top to begin with. And sometimes you need to shoot a little bit lower to make those incremental updates. So the effectiveness of this, as you can see from the top of the diagram, is very high. Okay, so when you get this right, when the collaboration between the two teams is very smooth, each of the teams specialize in what they do. Developers develop, operations teams operate, but they share and collaborate whenever needed. That is really the method or the model that most organizations are looking for. However, to be able to get there, it needs a few things to be in place. So earlier on, we talked about management buy-in or exec buy-in. So an understanding of this higher up in management is something that is really, really key to making this work. It also requires a number of changes to your organization structure to be able to make this work. Don't forget that in most organizations, developers and operations teams sit in fundamentally different parts of the business. So there's a lot of things that need to be broken down to be able to get them just to effectively work together in the first place. Another thing as well that you will get from this is that you will have one of the things that should be, I guess, expressed from the start of this is you should have a clear expressed and a clear demonstrable goal at the end. And what we mean by that is it's no good treating your DevOps implementation as a bit of a black box, okay? It's really, really important to make sure that when someone comes up to you and says, okay, yeah, I can see you have your dev and your ops teams, so I can see they're sat near each other, which is fundamentally different from most organizations. I can see you do some work together, but what is your one shared goal? And to answer that question, you really have to be able to clearly express what that goal is and be able to demonstrate it to people. Once you can do those two things, then you are probably a very mature part of your journey. And then it is around making continuous improvement of what you've done so far to be able to tweak, refine, and improve what you're doing to make sure that those teams stay on top of the game. And that is fundamental. Those points there and those things on this slide, when you hear the term high-functioning teams, this is fundamentally what a high-functioning team may look like. Okay, so one of the next models is called fully shared responsibilities. So this is where we work in a more product-oriented manner. So for instance, you have a product team that works on one product, you have a product team that works on another product, and the operations teams are integrated with those product teams. So the operations engineers within those teams only work on that one product, and there is little separation between those teams. So by definition, because of what they are both working on, those developers and those operations engineers are both working on that one single thing. That creates a highly focused team on that one shared purpose. So if you think earlier on, we talked about shared responsibility and shared goals, you can see how using those explanations from earlier on, this would really work for a lot of teams because it creates that highly focused, laser sharp effort on one specific purpose. And that is fundamental to making this work. So this is also really a form of what you saw on the previous slide as well. So it has some special features though. So one of the things that's different between the previous model, the gold and the banner, I guess, and this one, is that the teams do not share operations between different applications. Like I said, they are focused on one specific place. One of the places that this does not work is where you don't have a narrow product focus. This isn't relevant and doesn't really work that well. So if you have a small number of products, that's what I mean by narrow product focus here. If you have like 3 or 4 products within your organization, then it'll probably work really well. If you have one, it'll work really, really well. This is actually the model that Spotify use. So if you think of Spotify, they have one product, and that is the solution that allows you to play back and stream music. That is their product, and that is their focus. So they have teams that fundamentally work on those platforms and drive forward. If you were to look at this model outside and have a look around and search around for this, it would also be called no ops as well. That's another explanation for this model, is no ops. Okay, so ops as a platform is the next one. So this one is what you may start with lots of large monolithic model, sorry, not applications, large monolithic organizations. So in this model, there are ops teams which generally cannot or will not change. Okay, and that's probably a common scenario for most people. Watching the presentation, I would think, is that within their organization, there are certain parts of teams, it doesn't have to be ops, it most often not is, that don't want to change. Some characteristics of those organizations are that they are probably running in the cloud, or the operations team simply provide infrastructure and infrastructure support. So whether that infrastructure is cloud native infrastructure or cloud native resources, or whether it is traditional VMs and traditional infrastructure, it's irrelevant. So the ops team might only be focused on that. Then what we can do is overlay a virtual team on top of there, which acts as our expertise, and that is our DevOps team. So you can see from the diagram fundamentally how this would work. Your ops and dev teams would still stay separate, but you would have a DevOps team that lays directly on top of the developers. So if you think of that model, this is probably what a lot of organizations go to, where they don't have developers and ops work together. They have a team of DevOps engineers sit on top and work specifically with the developers. What this does for a lot of organizations where people cannot or will not change, or there is so much technical debt in process or applications that it's hard to do, we create a level of effectiveness. So we go from high effectiveness in that first model to medium in this one. So we trade that effectiveness for quicker and easier implementation. What it does mean, though, is that we will derive more value quicker than you would in the first model. So while the first model is the gold nirvana, it takes a long time to get there. But this will derive you more value a lot quicker than the model that we looked at first up. However, this does have a level of expiry on it, in all honesty. So this is something that you would, look at changing the more mature that team got. Okay, so the next one is quite a common one as well. This was DevOps as a service. So in smaller organizations where they may not have the money, expertise, or the staff hired to be able to lead and do this within their teams, this is a model that works really well. This is a model that you will also see if you outsource to service providers. So our DevOps team in this instance are really the ones that build environments, provide automation, and do the monitoring. So you can see in this model, the DevOps team, instead of sitting with the developers, they are sitting over the development and the operations teams. This is a great starting point. So you can see it has a medium level of effectiveness again, but whether you're going to the first model that we looked at or the previous model, this is a really good starting point. So it's really, really interesting to see how this starts to build up as you come through different levels of maturity to be able to then start to build up to ultimately where you want to be. And that is why it's really, really important to get to a point where you understand what your goal needs to be. If you don't understand what your DevOps goal is within your organization, then quite frankly, you will just be trying things for the sake of it. Just before we move on, I just saw a question come in, I think. Although I can't see the question anymore. I think it was from James. I don't know if James is there. Did you just ask a question on the chat?
Yeah, I did there, Martin. I was just asking about those two models you just showed us. How they work with how you fit them in with an agile framework. Do they work well with that?
Oh, okay. So you mean this one and this one?
And the previous one, yeah.
Okay. So the key thing, that's a really good question, actually. So thank you for asking that. So I'll answer this one now, so there's a bit of context before we get to the end. I don't want to be individuals in context. So yeah, great question. So as you know, right, regardless of what tooling you're using, again, this is not about tooling. So Agile is more the process side of it, and how you do maybe your sprint planning, your sprints, your retrospectives, your refinement, all of that kind of stuff. So what you need, what you know, the important thing to consider with this is if you are shooting for this model to start with, then it is only our DevOps team that are probably working in the Agile framework. The other two teams are just working with whatever they need to. But that DevOps team almost becomes an advocate for Agile working. And because they're sat in the development area, where, let's face it, in a lot of organizations, they are probably doing some Agile anyway, because that's where its roots are really in software engineering. It does work really well in this model, because you're working with people that fundamentally understand a lot of the parts of Agile around, gathering business requirements. You might use something like Gherkin to collect those business requirements, and that is something that is pretty well known to a lot of developers and a lot of engineers. So in the Ops as a platform model, it does work really, really well. In DevOps as a service, it works less well. So one of the reasons it works less well, especially in that service provider model that this is generally used for, is if you think that a service provider would work with multiple devs and dev teams and multiple ops teams, they cannot work in such a way that they work with 10 or 15 different different methods of doing Agile, because there are quite a lot to deliver Agile, whether they're just doing a form of Kanban, whether they're doing Scrum, or whether they're doing something in between, Scrumban, anything like that. It's very difficult for that one DevOps team at a service provider or for that service provider, to be able to work to different ones. So in that model, it doesn't work all that well. But if you are using this model in a smaller organization, then it can work very well, because again, you are working as a model that starts to overlay. And there's one specifically a little bit later on about DevOps advocacy. And there really is a lot of overlay between DevOps as a service and DevOps advocacy, and you'll see why in a little bit. So in summary, really, so this one, it kind of works pretty well as well in the fully shared responsibilities as well, because you're all focused on the same thing. So you are all part of one product team. So Agile works very well in that framework. It works pretty well in this one as well, depending on who's involved and the teams that you're working with. And then not so well in this one unless you are all part of the same organization, with the caveat of you could be actually doing some things in here that make you more aligned into the advocacy model that we'll come on to in a minute. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay, no, good question. Thank you for that one. So next one is DevOps team with an expiry. Okay, so again, this one is where we start to. It's important at what choices you make. Okay, so you can see the level of effectiveness in this model can be anywhere between low and high. But what this is, it's a temporary team. It says that they're a temporary team with a mission, right? And they say that because people that work in this team are really there to try and help bring those teams together. So where there's a high level of resistance between those dev teams and those operations teams, this team model is really where your goal as a DevOps team is to bring them together. And the reason the effectiveness can be anywhere between low and high is because it fundamentally depends on the people that you have in there, and it can depend on the people that you have working in those teams to be able to achieve some of those things. So it's very open-ended in a lot of ways as to how well this does or doesn't work, because you need quite specific skills. So it's okay understanding the technical skills in this area, but if you're working in this model, you have to have people in that DevOps team who can shift between developer and operation speak. I'm not saying they have to be the same person, although that does help, because you have to be able to understand each other still within that DevOps team. Otherwise, you risk splitting that DevOps team into two smaller bubbles that separate out and you achieve nothing. So it helps when you have people in the team that understand both Dev and Ops. Okay, so they think about details, and those details are what ultimately starts to help bring those teams together. So good example of this is you might have a conversation between the teams which is talking about deploying the latest version of an application that they've written, and there's conversation as to how it scales and whether it will work behind a load balancer on different instances. If you are a person that can happen to write code but fundamentally understand from an operational perspective how that might affect an implementation of code behind a load balancer and its ability to automatically pick up traffic and deal with it in a stateless way or a stateful way, depending on the application, can really help start to bring those people together, because you know, as that DevOps person, you know what questions to ask the developer, you know what questions to ask the operations engineer. And that's what really starts to bring those two teams together. One thing that is, above all, one of the most important things in this model, though, is you cannot give responsibilities to that team as part of the development and the operations team, right? They have to be there to be able to drive the DevOps values and the DevOps ways of working with that team. You shouldn't be giving them deployment tasks, build tasks. They should be advocating and teaching members of those teams how to do those different things. And that's really, again, depending on how well people adhere to that advice, really affects the effectiveness of how well this model will work. Okay, so next one is around the advocacy team. We've mentioned this one a couple of times. So the advocacy team works really well where you start to need to facilitate between devs and ops teams that have a large gap. So it is like the previous model that we looked at. However, in this model, there is no expiry. They stay engaged and they do ongoing work and ongoing engagement with that team to improve the level of maturity. And before they engage with that team in this advocacy model, you are given, as part of that DevOps team, a specific remit of improving collaboration and improving cooperation. And you are given set targets to be able to meet in terms of proving that team's maturity. So as part of that, you have general advocacy of the model and DevOps in general, and that's the practices, the processes, and the tooling. It's a full stack. But you also help spread awareness of what DevOps will help the teams achieve, because that is what starts to get people on board. You know, peer level discussion on the ground is what fundamentally gets people on board with it. It's not exec sponsorship saying, you know, we fully back what we're going to do with this approach. We know it's going to do X, Y, and Z for us as a business, et cetera, et cetera. Is people on the ground that say, you know, it might be even a simple discussion as look at this cool technology. And that starts to get people interested. And once they get interested, they start to learn more about DevOps. And then they pick up just how much it will help them as a team and as an individual grow what they do and what they give back. And then you'll start to get more business knowledge, and it kind of goes on and grows from there. So whereas in the previous model, there's a fixed expiry and the team backs away, the purpose of the advocacy team is to stay engaged until there becomes such a time where the team can back off, and that is based on a set maturity or a set goal. So you know where you want to get to. Once you get to there, the advocacy team can back off. They will always be there to be able to help them, but they will then start working with another team. And those are fundamentally the differences between those two models that we've just gone through. There are lots of other models available, right? Okay, so there's a whole host more that we could have gone through. There's ones that include data teams. There's obviously security. Let's not forget the importance of security. There's one of the series is on security, the last one. So we'll pick up on that a lot more then. But fundamentally, those are the key ones, okay? There's also Google site reliability engineering model in there as well, which is very popular and works very, very well. You will see numerous quotes from people at Google saying, we do not do DevOps, right? It's arguable, well, whether they do or they don't. It's kind of on the fence with it. From my perspective, it feels like they do DevOps from the stuff I read. I obviously don't have any first-hand experience, but it feels like that's exactly what happens. So there are lots of different models, okay? And it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's one of the key things that I think I'd like people to take away from this, is that if you are in an organization that is going through this level of transformation, okay, it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one organization may work for another organization, or it may not. And if it does work for that organization, you may still have to do things slightly differently. The other thing as well, I think, is on the top point there, DevOps is not so much about the technology. Okay, it's a big part of it, but in the grand scheme of things, you have to get the culture, people, and process right first. Technology will follow, and technology will add, again, more value on top of the value you have already derived from the top. Okay. Make sure you have the ability to change your model as you mature as a team. So we talked about this a little bit throughout the presentation, in that it's important to make sure that you don't stick to that one model, and you realize that as you grow as a team, so can your things that you need to do as a team. And that might mean that you need to change your model. You might need to go from type 1 to type 2, or type 3 to type 1. You know, there's lots of different ways that can work. It's not set. Another key thing as well is think about some of the things that we talked about right at the top. And if you work with a business quite a lot, you may be thinking that there's a few things here which can apply outside of technology. And you're absolutely right. Okay, so while the principles of DevOps really take from software engineering, the fundamental core of that is Agile. And James asked a really good question about how Agile fits into some of those models earlier on. The same approach can be taken to teams outside of technology. And I have done work with teams outside of technology, so procurement teams and finance teams, to work in a more Agile way. So that obviously the true fundamentals of DevOps they cannot do, but they can do elements of it like Agile. The more people that work in Agile within an organization, the more effective you will be as an Agile engineering team. That's a simple truth. Again, buy-in has to come down from the top. Okay, it will not work without it. And then, second to last point I want to make on here before taking any questions is that bear in mind that this is not a quick process. Okay. I've done some work with organizations over 6 months plus, and we've made excellent progress, but there is still a lot more to do. So transformation can take months, if not years. And then to finish up on one of the things I would talk about was when it comes down to pure business benefits. So there's a lot of business benefits to DevOps, but one of them, quite naturally, talking around business, is around revenue. Okay, so if we made some broad assumptions, let's say that within our organization, when we release a new piece of software, we get lots of revenue, and our revenue drops down until the next release and then shoots up again. So if you repeated that through a process, you get what's called a sawtooth graph. So there's lots of peaks and troughs. So, you know, assumptions are great in there. And there's obviously a lot of flaws with that model in that not every release makes a profit. Some don't. Some are technical debt releases, those kind of things. So you know, there are definitely a lot of flaws with that way of thinking, but it's a good way to set out why this kind of stuff is so important. So let's now work on the premise that time is money. Okay, so if you're able to speed up your development, if you're able to speed up your development as a team and do twice as many releases, and then you're able to speed up that release process by using automation twice as more, you then effectively could at least double your revenue as an organization. So what it does is it gives you more teeth on a sawtooth graph. So it doesn't really fix some of the fundamentals of what's wrong, but you can start to make more revenue as a business. So from a business perspective, think about it that way. And this is why DevOps is so popular and has so much traction within a lot of large organizations, because it can directly impact revenue, especially if you are selling services and you're selling software that those teams work on. Now think about it from another way. What if you're able to smooth out some of those teeth so that your profit doesn't dip until you release new software? So that's where you start to put in other pieces of principles of DevOps, like Lean, where you smooth out processes, where you release on demand. Whenever the feature is ready, you release it. That way you can keep your profit steady while you've improved your processes and you've automated more and more. So it's not on this one, but the final takeaway I'd say from that is try and think of it like that. When you're thinking, how will this improve my organization or my company's goals? How do I explain to our manager why we need to be doing DevOps? Think about that model. Think about a sawtooth graph and think about how you can smooth out some of those teeth so that revenue stays at a specific level all of the time rather than peaking and troughing. So that's really the key things that I'd like people to take away from this session. So first of all, thanks very much everyone for taking some time out. It's very good to see so many people joining and coming on. I see we have another question from Charles. I'll read it out in case no one can see the chat. So how long did it take you to mature as an individual in DevOps? What your professional experience, tips and takeaways for individuals starting out? Okay, so really good question, Charles. Thanks for that. So I want to try and do it as much as justice as possible in the amount of time that we have. But just like it takes you a while to transform as an organization, as an individual, it takes you a lot of time as well. So if I could point you at some good reading as well, in the interest of time as well, you know, there's some good things around what makes a good DevOps engineer. So if it's a DevOps engineer that you're shooting for, then, and you want to go up as the DevOps engineer, senior, principal, or master, whatever it is, then there's some great content out there about how you mature as a DevOps engineer and what skills it is that you need. And it's not so much about the technical skills, it's more about some of the softer skills as well. So in terms of experience, you know, it's a bit of a cliche, but don't give up, right? It takes a long time to get a level of experience. And one of the things I would say around this is make sure that you have a rounded view of what DevOps means, because every organization will approach this very differently. And when it's done differently, you almost get into the trap that this is how you do DevOps, when actually you can go to a different organization and they do it very differently. So I would make sure that you keep keep an open mind, I guess, is the right thing. For me, that's the best way to grow in this field, is to make sure that you are always evolving your knowledge and always keeping up with the current trends, just like you would in technology. Okay, so I saw someone put their hand up as well next. I think it was Darren. If she's still on.
Hi, Martin. Thanks very much. Really interesting session.
No worries.
It sounds like a DevOps leader needs to be lots of things, including a politician and a referee.
Yeah,
at times.
Absolutely.
I'm just interested in what's the kind of split as far as your engagements are concerned when you get involved. Do you get involved most often when it's the beginning of the project, or I can imagine that organizations might start and then find they get into trouble and then pull you guys in afterwards? Is that what would you say is the most common scenario?
So what you've described there is actually the most common scenario. So organizations will try some stuff and they will realize that they can't do it. Or they realize that they don't have the experience to do it. It's not that they can't do it, it's that they don't have that rounded view of which is the best way to go. So I could put in a shameful plug for our DevOps consultancy services, but I won't do that. But there are things that you can do, right, around assessing maturity, guiding people in the right direction, working with the teams within that organization to figure out what they actually want to achieve and then push them in the direction that they need to. That's really, for me, what people talk about DevOps consultants or DevOps architects. That's really what those roles do for me. They go to organizations and they help with the roadblocks of transformation, right? Just like the organization will apply changes to people, process, and technology to unblock roadblocks on their side, an external consultant or architect with the DevOps knowledge can go in and unblock the whole transformation journey when it gets stuck.
Great. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next Friday.
Yeah, no problem. See you later. Cheers. Thanks for joining. So I see another question from Praveen as well, which is, have you seen wrong implementation of DevOps principles and what were the repercussions of it? So yes, plenty in short. So I think I'll try to be cautious of excuse me, what I say so I don't give away anything about the organization, but I think the most, if I try and generalize it a bit, that's probably best. So I think, there's obviously this movement of DevSecOps, okay? And DevSecOps is an interesting one because it's the concept of adding the security team into the mix and shifting the process of security to the left. Now, my argument is that you should have already been doing that anyway, because security has always been such an important part of what we do in technology. Right? There's a massive laser focus on technology at the minute. Excuse me. But why I think that's become a big thing, okay, is because we're now at a point where I think some people have taken DevOps to the extreme from a technology perspective and have put so much focus in on automating things that they have those automation processes and those automation pipelines now have holes in, and those holes are now starting to be exploited into an organization and a way into that organization's data. So I have seen stuff like that happen. And the repercussions of it are hopefully it's fairly obvious, but the repercussions of doing that are, as an organization, from a DevOps perspective, you have your InfoSec team jumping up and down on you, and they are then basically in a position where they have no option but to shut down what you're doing. And that puts the whole, that puts the brakes on anything that you're doing. So, how do you stop that happening? Like, don't forget about fundamentals, right? It's easy to forget about the fundamentals, but architecture principles and security principles, whenever you're doing anything around DevOps innovation and transformation, just don't forget those points, okay? Because those are the points that will, you know, add to what you're doing. And this is why when we start to add things like security to pipelines, we shift the risk so much to the left that we actually end up in a position where the risk is at the source code level. And that's why we put tools and that's why we put processes in place at the source code level to be able to stop some of those things from happening. So I hope that answers the question. So another question has come in, I think. So yes, here we go. So are DevOps adoption or transformation challenges the same as agile adoption or transformation technology, transformation in organizations? Collaboration between DevOps versus collaboration between end users and devs. Oh, so that is a good question. So broadly, yes. Okay, so broadly the challenges are the same. I actually think the challenges are in some ways slightly easier. So they're slightly easier because both parties understand technology and understand what's happening. So I think that is one thing that makes it easier. However, one thing that makes it harder is also the same point, right? One thing that makes it harder is technology teams. And there is more resistance to change within those technology teams. You know, the collaboration between end users and developers is often quite straightforward. Developers will often see, end users will often see that developers are reaching out. They will go through the process a few times and they will see that they are getting more value out of what's happening. So it's a very easy sell, I think, that process, although there are challenges. But I think those challenges are definitely replicated between dev and ops teams as well. They just have a potentially slightly different angle to them. Okay, so there's no more questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions off mute if they want to come off mute and ask a question? Okay, so one more question. Okay. Okay, so just while that question is coming through, I'll just tell you a little bit about next week. So the session next week, which is actually Thursday, not Friday. I hope people notice that, so that the live one is actually next Thursday. So I'm going to be talking about achieving your DevOps goals. So we set some principles and some groundwork in this one. So next week, we're basically going to be talking about the process of making sure that you can define and achieve your goals. How do you make sure that you stay on track, and how do you make sure that you get to where you need to be ultimately? We talked a lot in this session around how important it is to make sure you define where you want to be and where you need to go. So the next session next week is really around making sure that we have the ability to look at what that is, measure and course correct and adjust if needed. Okay, so so you mentioned earlier it's complex in larger organizations where there are several ops departments, several different development departments, and also business IT together. What approach would be suitable to try to form a strategy? Okay, so first up, that's a good question. So first up, again, we've talked about top-down buy-in. That is the first step, right? It has to come from the top of the departments involved that this is the way you want to go. But they have to understand the value of what this brings to the organization. So they have to understand that by doing this, technology teams can now more closely align to and help influence business KPIs. Is fundamentally what this is about. So that's step one. The next step is starting small. So in larger organizations, it's very easy to think, let's do this massive big kickoff from project and let's do all of these workshops and all this kind of stuff. But actually, you'll achieve very little in quite a bit of wasted time. So I would start with distinct teams, right? What is in a large organization, what is the poster seller, or what is the poster product of that organization? And work with that team to improve what they do, start to show people that by doing this, you can get more value out of what you're doing. And that will then start to become infectious and filter out to other people. So the strategy is start small and go bigger. Another strategy as well is use simulation sessions as well. So there's a book out which is the Lego Chocolate and Scrum game, and it's a simulation game where you do various sprints throughout the day to sell on a marketplace Lego characters, and there's certain rules around what you can and can't do. And every sprint changes some of those rules around what you can and can't do, so that every sprint you do, you become more and more productive. In a large organization, that's a great way to get people engaged without going through slides of this is how it works, this is how it works, this is why we should be doing it, because you let people live and breathe exactly how to do it and what's happening. So that's excuse me, that's a really good way to think about it, and that's a really good way for larger organizations to be able to think about it like that. So hopefully that answers the question. So another couple I can see come on. No problem, you're welcome. Thanks for the question. That was a really good one. So we are talking a lot about data ops. Is it a better way to achieve DevOps adoption in organizations? So my honest answer would be it depends. Right? If your product is data driven and has very little software interaction or software component to it, then data ops is probably a great place to start because it's more directly relevant and related to what you do as an organization. If data is an element, then I would say focus on the fundamentals, right? Don't do data ops with the data and ops teams, and don't do DevOps with the developers and the operations teams. Do the fundamentals of DevOps and then layer data on top afterwards. I think you will probably have a lot more success doing it that way than trying to mix and match between, if that's the intention of the question. Okay, so James asked a question again. So capability and or maturity, looking at where an organization is in the DevOps journey. Okay, so again, really good question. So it's actually a mix of both, right? So my organization I work for in Soda, we do a maturity assessment for clients, and it's a big, long one-day assessment with lots of different questions. And we look at 9 pillars. So we look at technology, leadership, we look at CI, CD, we look at lots of different things. And reason I'm telling you that is really that we look at maturity of capabilities. Okay, that's an odd thing to say, but we look at the maturity of those capabilities within there. So they are each distinct things. So when we're looking at where an organization is in that DevOps journey, we can come out with a score at the end, okay? And the score at the end will basically tell us where they need to focus on time to be able to improve their level of maturity. And it might be that they do certain things better than others, okay? So it's difficult to give examples or quantify where you might need some effort. But one of the things that it might come out of their saying is that the organization needs to be able to basically go in and they need to improve what they're doing from a source control perspective. But actually their release process is really, really good. So again, from that perspective, you could argue from a capability perspective that they're actually very capable because the business still realizes the value of each release. But actually, from a capability perspective, there are things that they could do better. And by doing those things better, they end up more mature and better maturity, ultimately will end up giving you better yield and better value back to the business. So I hope that's a really good question. I like that one. So I hope that answers the question, James.
Sorry to cut across you, Martin. I actually have to pop off for a meeting now. So if it's all right, I'm just gonna wrap a few things up, and then if you want to continue on the Q&A session after.
Yeah. Okay.
So sorry, I see there's still a few questions there. So if you guys haven't had a chance to get your free resources and register, click that first link there. We'll get these materials shared on our GitHub. And of course, we'll be posting this on our YouTube channel. There's the link for next Thursday session, as Martin said. And there's a very short survey if everyone could click that. And I'm just going to pop off now, but thank you so much, Martin. And I'll see you next week.
Tuesday. Yeah, speak to you later. Okay, so let's go through the last couple of questions, and just mindful of people's time. Quite happy to take any questions on Twitter or anything afterwards. My username is Mr. Coops, MrCoups, if anyone wants to drop us a question on there. So next question is from Charles. Is ITIL v4 incompatible with DevOps, or are the two frameworks finding synergies? So yeah, good question. So if we were talking about ITIL v3, then they are pretty incompatible. But actually in ITIL v4, there are some modules in ITIL v4 that talk about agile working, and they talk about DevOps. So they are getting closer together. So are they completely in step and in line with each other? No, they are not, but they are not intended to be. But there is now a realization within ITIL that DevOps is a big thing, and lots of organizations are doing it, and they needed to adapt what's happening from an ITIL perspective. So yes, they are finding synergies. Those synergies will get stronger, I think, as the versions of ITIL develop. So who knows where it will go, quite frankly. I'm not an ITIL expert anymore myself. I've not been involved in much ITIL for quite a while now, but yes, they are finding synergies, and yes, I expect them to get stronger as things progress. Okay, so yeah, really good question from Praveen, which is the one metric you will use to evaluate the DevOps implementation in a project, which is at the initial stage of DevOps, and this metric will help improve the DevOps practice. Okay, so great question, right? I'm really glad someone's asked this one. So this is a really interesting one.